All right, let's get right into it. For basically all of human history, we've been wrestling with one of the biggest questions imaginable. In this explainer, we're going to explore what a meaningful life is all about, not just through age-old philosophy, but through the lens of some really surprising new science.
So let's just start right there. What does a meaningful life actually look like? To you. I mean, think about it for a second. It's a deeply personal question, but it's also a question that connects every single one of us.
For most of history, the answers were all over the place. But what's so fascinating is that today, a coherent picture is finally starting to emerge. Experts from completely different worlds, philosophy, religion, hard science, they're all beginning to kind of agree on what the core parts of a meaningful life actually are.
To really get this new consensus, though, we first have to go back and understand the classic debate that shaped so much of how we think about this. And the question is simple. Is meaning something we find out in the world, or is it something we have to create ourselves? So in one corner, you have thinkers like Aristotle. For him, meaning is discovered. It's about figuring out your true nature and living up to your potential for excellence. He called this eudaimonia, or just human flourishing. Then in the other corner, you've got people like Jean-Paul Sartre. He argued that meaning is created. His whole thing was that we're born as blank slates, condemned to be free, which means it's entirely up to us to invent our own meaning through the choices we make.
And this brings in a really interesting third view. Albert Camus tells the story of Sisyphus, the guy from Greek myth doomed to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity, just to watch it roll back down. It sounds like the most pointless thing ever, right? But Camus says Sisyphus finds meaning not in the task itself, but in his defiance of it. He creates meaning through his attitude towards a fate he has to discover. The meaning is born right there in the struggle itself. Okay, so let's shift gears. Let's move away from these big philosophical ideas and see what happens when modern science gets a hold of this question. Because believe it or not, psychologists today can actually measure what gives people a sense of meaning. And the results, well, they're pretty eye-opening.
And we're not just talking about theory here. Scientists are hitting this with massive amounts of data. Take this recent Pew Research Center study. It involved almost 19,000 adults across 17 different advanced economies. The scale here is just enormous. It gives us this incredible global snapshot of what people actually value.
So, what did this huge study find? The consistency is just astounding. When you look at the data, you see that across all these wildly different cultures, the number one source of meaning, by a huge margin, was family. In 14 out of the 17 countries, our connections to other people came first. Not our job, not how much money we have, but our relationships. This is a huge clue from science. Meaning seems to be deeply, deeply connected to other people. So we know relationships are a massive piece of the puzzle. But what does a meaningful life actually feel like? Psychologists have broken this down into 3 core pillars. First, there's coherence, that feeling that your life makes sense, that it hangs together like a story. Then there's purpose, having goals and a sense of direction. And finally, significance, the belief that your life matters, that your existence has value. And we can get even more specific. Building on those pillars, a ton of research has identified 4 basic psychological needs that are like the building blocks of meaning. First, autonomy, having a sense of choice. Competence, feeling like you're good at what you do. Relatedness, which we just saw is huge, that need to connect. And finally, beneficence, the feeling that you're having a positive impact on others. Get this, when these 4 needs are being met, they can account for up to 70% of a person's feeling of meaning. That's huge. With all this data, we can start to push back against some of the most common ideas we have about where meaning comes from, a lot of which turn out to be wrong. Okay, here's a big one. We have this really powerful story in our culture that true meaning can only be forged in fire, that you have to go through something awful to find purpose. But is that actually true? So here's the deal. Suffering can absolutely be a path to meaning. There's no doubt about it. But, and this is a big but, it is not a prerequisite. It's not the only way. In fact, the research is clear that positive experiences, things like joy, gratitude, deep love, getting lost in a creative project, are just as powerful and honestly much more common ways to build a deeply meaningful life.
And what about the other huge one? We all chase financial security, but does having more wealth actually translate into a more meaningful life?
The answer from a massive 132-nation study is a surprisingly sharp no. As countries get richer, life satisfaction goes up. People feel happier, more comfortable, but their sense of meaning, that often stays flat or can even start to go down. This is such a critical point.
being happy is not the same thing as having a meaningful life. So all of this brings us to a really powerful new way to think about the whole thing, a way to finally resolve that old fight between discovering meaning and creating it from scratch. Let's go right back to that fundamental question we started with. Are we discovering our place in the universe, like Aristotle thought, or are we creating value in a void, like Sartre argued? After looking at all of this, from the ancient philosophers to the modern data, maybe the biggest insight is that we've been asking the wrong question this whole time. Maybe it's not a simple either-or choice.
Perhaps the best way to think about it is this. Meaning isn't a rock you find, and it's not something you make out of thin air. It's something you cultivate. Day by day, choice by choice, like a garden. And this garden metaphor just works so well because it brings everything together. Think about it. You need soil, right? That's the real world around you, their relationships, the actual needs in your community. You also need seeds. Those are the cultural stories and values you inherit. And then, crucially, you need the tending. That's you, your active choices, your passion, what you decide to care for. You need all three for meaning to grow. So, after going through thousands of years of thought and mountains of data, this is the definition we can land on. A meaningful life is when you are actively engaged with projects and relationships that matter to you, that connect to something bigger than you are, and that all weave together into a story that makes sense. And that leaves us with one final thought, a question that really only you can answer. This isn't just some abstract idea, it's a practical daily thing. So when you look at your own life, how will you tend your garden?